Welcome to another exciting episode of Kevjet, the podcast. I'm excited to introduce this week's guest, Dr. Nick Santo, LGBT therapist specializing in religious trauma and patients exposed to conversion therapy. It's Pride Month. The general public see parades, festivals, music, glitter, but there's another side to Pride, and we talk about it in this episode.
That's like the surface level stuff that people see and often criticize. And in our pre-conversation, we were talking about like what was going on, what goes on before that. No one sees the pain and distress and despair that happens before that, or what happens after that when they go home and maybe that person is not out to their family and they have to go back to living their life in the closet.
We discuss all the struggles associated with coming out.
What ends up happening, especially for people who are closeted and early on in that space, you just consume, and you hold on to all this hate. And the hate's not even yours, right? And it's poisoning you. So then where do you go for that? You hold on to that, you develop depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, which I had. I frequently thought about death and dying. I actually just wrote a paper about it, it's coming out later this year about just my own internal workings of how holding on to all of that deeply affected me to this point of depression where I just not only didn't want to live anymore, even though I didn't do anything, I didn't make any attempts or anything, but the thoughts were there.
So why choose this specialty?
In 2018, I went back to school to get my doctorate. And in that time, I started to really focus on religious trauma because I was working with several people who I started noticing that religious-based values and morals and were deeply embedded in their way of thinking and living their lives. Also, how cyclical the pain was in that process, because it was a constant reminder that you're gay, you can't, do this, or you're a sinner, or you're that. And that oftentimes got reinforced by the family members. In that time frame, I did a little bit of a deeper dive into what that does to us and what that does to a sense of self. And what I found was religion itself, there was a lot of literature on the healing and curative factors of religion. There's nothing about when religion is used to cause harm. They don't realize that the harm they're causing, I think they actually think that they're doing something good. I dove even deeper into conversion therapy and I was surprised by what I saw. It's actually quite sickening that it even is public.
I was absolutely shocked about these details about conversion therapy.
That ban is only for licensed professionals. So if you're not a licensed professional, you can still conduct conversion therapy. So there are no laws around that and no repercussions. It's terrifying.
We discuss monogamy and a gay relationship.
So what I want to say is that, and which a point you made earlier, which I thought was really important, is that try not to be so quick to judge someone else's relationship. It's not yours, right?
We end this heavy conversation with Kevjet's quick-fire questions.
Oh my gosh, I was just thinking about this when I was walking my dog the other day.
Pride is a celebration of how far we've come, but this conversation is what you won't hear on the 6 o'clock news. Here is my conversation with psychotherapist Nick Santo. Welcome to Kevjet the podcast. Nick Santo, psychotherapist based in New York. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think this will be a great conversation, especially because it is Pride Month. I think that the general public see Pride as this very colorful celebration. They see the parade, they see the flags, they see the outrageous outfits, and everybody having fun and smiling. But there is a reality to that as well, where people struggle with coming out and being their true selves. And there's lots and lots of different reasons for that. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. I first, my shirt is very colorful and quite deliberate for Pride and for our conversation today. To your point with what the people see on the outside, they're like at Pride specifically, is mostly like they're seeing people really express themselves in ways that they've not been able to. And I think you probably already know that, right? This is an opportunity to really like the space from a march, a protest, to self-expression and openness amongst a community of hundreds of thousands of people around the world is so liberating, and a moment to really get in touch with yourself as a person and as part of a community. And that's, I think, what shapes us as who we are, and also what helps us feel whole as a person, right? And part of a community. And so that's like the surface level stuff that people see and often criticize. And in our pre-conversation, we were talking about like what was going on, what goes on before that. No one sees the pain and distress and despair that happens before that, or what happens after that when they go home and maybe that person is not out to their family and they have to go back to living their life in the closet. So what's being criticized is quite myopic and not very well thought out either about human experience and queer experience.
Exactly. What inspired you to become a psychotherapist?
So interestingly enough, my own internalized homophobia early on, right, I think prevented me from really wanting to dig into LGBT plus issues just generally. And I think at the time I was like, I don't want to specialize. I don't want to niche myself. I want to be able to open myself to more population kind of generalized like work, And I think that was my own fear because in the process of working through going through grad school, going through postgraduate training for therapy, I think it brings up a lot of pain. You have to confront a lot of your own traumas. You have to confront a lot of your own your wounds and really rethink the world and rethink your internal world, and then try to experience it in a new way. And that's terrifying, right? And I think early on I didn't necessarily feel compelled to specialize in working with LGBTQ plus people because of my own fear of what might come up. I think that what was happening for me. But then when I realized, when I came to terms with the fear of that, and in part how irrational it was, and that actually I can take the reins of my life and understand it in a better way and understand who I am and help, that changed everything for me. And what motivated me to become a therapist, I think, is not queer related. It was trauma related. Both. I had a close friend of mine who experienced some severe trauma. I myself went through a couple of traumatic incidents, and so separate from sexual identity, right? And it led me to this place, right? And I think when you grow up having experienced traumatic moments, sometimes what ends up happening, particularly in relational trauma, is that you learn how to assess the world around you, and you learn how to take care of the world around you, in essence, to hopefully protect yourself too, preserve your sense of your identity, even if what you're putting out there is not 100% you, but that you're safe. So it's more of survival. What that ended up happening for me is that I was like, oh, so helping profession makes sense, right? And I felt like it was just like a natural growth to into this field for me, with a lot of fear, right, and a lot of unpacking that internalized homophobia. And also feeling like I'm not an imposter. That was the other thing I think that kind of was coming up for me a lot early on. And occasionally when I give presentations or do podcasts, I get worried, right? It's like that old fear of imposter syndrome comes back, right? Who cares what I have to say? Am I smart enough to say something? Do I have enough impact to to help someone? Right? And that negative talk that I don't have what it takes comes from a long history of experiences that made me believe that. And that took a lot of unpacking too. So I know I answered more than what you asked, but that's
Right.
like it. Yeah.
How do you offload at the end of the day? Because with your patients, you must be reliving a lot of your own stuff.
Yes.
At the end of the day, how do you shut that off?
It's not something that shuts off, but I think I like the way you framed the question at the start, is because I think that there's a lot of self-reflection, a lot of having self-compassion, I think. And there are little things, like you see on Instagram and TikTok, like little tips you can do, life hacks, whatever. I don't hate them. I don't love them, but I think they can be helpful. I try to incorporate some of those things like grounding techniques to just get myself grounded at the end of the day and kind of refocus on me. But a lot of the traumas and experiences that I hear from the people I work with, it still follows me, right? And then I start thinking about my own stuff. I have to say that, when I talked about community earlier, I think that I have a wonderful, very loving, very compassionate husband. And sometimes I can talk about something, and sometimes, I don't have to, and he just knows. And I can share that. And we have that open line of dialogue, which to say, just to be clear about that, us being able to do that wasn't something that just kind of happened. Right? We both had to be really conscious of how do we be there? How can we be there for one another? How can we deliberately really listen and understand and be there and help each other through difficult times, right? Because I may be a therapist taking this stuff home with me every day, and I have my own things that might happen throughout my life, but so does he, right? And so we have to be able to have that kind of two-way, bi-directional, dialogue and compassion.
Sure. One thing that I found quite interesting was in previous months, I did for International Men's Day, I had a panel of men, and we talked about different triggers and we talked about different issues. But one thing that kept coming up was, just man up, just man up. And the same thing kind of happens in this conversation with, that's so gay.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you have somebody who's struggling with their identity and they're hanging out with their friends, so say that we're talking about a younger generation, they're out with their friends and someone just, oh, why did you do that? That's so gay. Or what you said, that's so gay. That's a trigger. And that's going to shut somebody down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's the same for a straight person when they're saying, oh, just man up, don't cry, or men don't cry, like all those different sayings. Yeah. So how does one deal with triggers like that?
Well, I think first is to be aware that it's a trigger for you and what does it bring up for you. And once you have a general sense of what that is, what is it doing for you, you can hopefully have a better sense of what you need to do internally in terms of what do you want to tell yourself, because the trigger itself is it's implying something, right? And what is it implying for you? How are you reading that? How do you think those other people are reading you? Now, I mean, I was born in the 80s, but I grew up in the 90s where "that's so gay" was something that was just used so just for everything. I didn't never said anything, to friends and early on because I wasn't out, obviously, so I didn't really confront it. But there were times, when I got older, and it was still happening in my early 20s, and I would tell some friends hey, I don't really. If you're gonna say that, then that's up to you, but please don't say it in front of me, right? And here's why. Right. And I try to explain and I try to engage in a conversation about that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think for younger folks, I also heard it in my family or making fun of gay people in different ways, name calling, people who weren't in the room. But I mean, I was there and they didn't know I was gay at the time. Right. And so there are some times where you're not going to be able to confront it, or you're not going to feel safe enough to confront it. And so you have to recognize that, there's a time and a place to confront certain things. And then what is your aftercare? Because I think that at the end, you cannot hold on to that. It's easier to, because I think what ends up happening, especially for people who are closeted and early on in that space, you just consume and consume and consume and consume, and you hold on to all this hate. And the hate's not even yours, right? And it's poisoning you. So then where do you go for that? And I highly stress, find someone, anyone, who is a compassionate person, who is affirming of you, and you can go and talk about these things with, right? So if it's a friend, an appropriate adult, that you feel safe with, and a counselor that you feel safe with. And there are signs, I think, to know if someone's affirming as well. I don't know, you can't see it here, but I have a little pride flag, in my office. And I mean, not that I hide who I am and who I help, but I think it is helpful as a reminder, it is a safe space here to do that. So I think try to be aware that you have to connect with someone. You cannot hold on to all of this on your own. And I speak from experience because I did hold on to it, a lot of it on my own growing up, where and like many youth now, and over the years, or presently, you hold on to that, you develop depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, which I had. I frequently thought about death and dying. I actually just wrote a paper about it, like, and it's coming out later this year about just my own internal workings of how holding on to all of that like, deeply affected me into like this point of depression where I just not only didn't want to live anymore, even though I didn't do anything, I didn't make any attempts or anything, but the thoughts were there, right? And I didn't know what to do with those thoughts, so it just kept escalating, right? And then it got to a point where I was like, I'm not going to live beyond the age of 30, right? And so why 30? And I'm not going to get into that today, but there's a reason. There's a whole history, a whole thing, a whole reason why everything that kind of built up to that idea of like I'm not going to live past 30, so let me just enjoy my life for whatever I can do with it, right? And when I was 18 and out of the house and doing my own things and experiencing the world differently, I didn't always make the best decisions either. Right? And I think that's a common story for a lot of queer youth.
Definitely. It definitely is. And I know we're talking about coming out, but and when people talk about coming out, they sort of insinuate somebody coming out young.
Yeah.
But coming out later in life is an issue.
Yeah.
And that has its own struggles as well, because it's almost like you have a past life and you're going to begin a new life.
Yeah, and that can be terrifying, right? You're starting a new life at a later age, and I in terms of a marker for later age, I think that we, like you said, we assume adolescence or, in your 20s. I came out fully in my 20s, but there are some people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or later who are coming out, right? And we see it in some celebrities as well, like Wayne Brady. He just came out like not that long ago, and several other people just coming out later in life, and that we have to think about, understanding like what that process was up to that point. There's a reason. There was something that was going on for that particular person they couldn't do it. They couldn't come to terms with things without themselves and put it out there, right? So what were those barriers? What were those walls? And and I think when someone who is ready to finally step out into the world, it's all new, right?
It is new. And those people could have families, so they could have been
Yes,
married and
exactly.
children. And then they're going to have to think of the response. They're going to have that conversation with their loved ones.
Yeah, and the stakes are much higher than I think that you might lose a family you built and create, and likely love you. I think sometimes people also think that like I'm coming out later in life. I'm married, I have kids, and that the assumption is that well, you don't love the family, you hurt the family, and that is not really what's happening. They do, but they also know that they are likely causing harm, like emotional harm because of this, and it's also harm and pain that they've been carrying for however long, right? And it's trying to reconcile that. But I think that sometimes does the risk outweigh, do the pros outweigh the cons here, right? And that is a big factor in some people's decisions whether to step out and share who they are.
Yeah, it's very scary. Which brings me to one of the topics that you cover, which I'm fascinated with, and it's religious trauma and shame.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit, which kind of coincides with conversion therapy.
Yes.
So so maybe just explain that a little bit.
Sure. So in 2018, I went back to school. Was it 2018? I don't remember. It was pre-COVID. I went back to school to get my doctorate. And in that time, I started to really focus on religious trauma because I was working with several people who I started noticing that religious-based like values and morals and were deeply embedded in their way of thinking and living their lives. Also, how cyclical the pain was in that process because it was a constant reminder that you're gay, you can't, do this, or you're a sinner, or you're that. And that oftentimes got reinforced by the family members who were part of certain congregations that were helping to, that were continuing to send this message to their children. And, in that time frame, I did a little bit of a deeper dive into what that does to us and what that does to a sense of self. And, I think what I found was religion itself. There was a lot of literature on the healing and curative factors of religion. There's nothing about how, when religion is used to cause harm, even if it is not meant to, right? Because I think a lot of people who are highly religious and are trying to convert their children in either way from like sexual identity or gender identity, is they don't realize that the harm they're causing. I think they actually think that they're doing something good. But the evidence and the papers and the research that's out there now shows that it's not. It's increasingly harmful, and it increases the likelihood of suicidal ideation attempts and other like psychiatric diagnoses. So yeah, so that kind of that opened my mind and opened up the doors for me to really dig a little deeper into religious trauma and what that looks like. And then from there, I dove even deeper into conversion therapy, and I was surprised by what I saw in terms of the access to it, and organizations of licensed professionals who still advocate for it. So
that's still happening in lots of cases in
yes.
even just America, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's here. There's an organization, they constantly changing their name. And I wonder why. Like, but they're constantly changing the name, and it's basically an organization of licensed mental health professionals and other healthcare professionals. It's not just mental health, but it's largely mental health people that advocate for the research and study of conversion therapy. A lot of their research data has just kind of been debunked and bias. I think for me, when in my process of like my own research, my own writing, and my own treatment in my practice, I tried to, as scared as I was early on, I was like, I need to be a voice in this space. I need to help with changing the narrative around being queer across the spectrum, and that our approaches need to change, and that kind of research shouldn't even be published. It's actually quite sickening that it even is published, but they're funded. I mean, some people are. Some organizations are funded and can get it published in their own right. It just regardless of it being debunked.
And we were saying before we started recording this, we were saying how in the news you'll see breaking news: so and so country has just banned conversation therapy, and then it's kind of a ripple effect, and then you'll see another country, but as you were explaining, there's so many ways around it that
Yes.
It can still happen.
Yes, yeah, there are, and it does. So over the last like 5 years or so, I've seen that, we were talking about the trend, and it has been trending where like conversion therapy has been banned. But what I noticed, and I don't know about other countries right now, because my focus has been mainly the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to speak for those countries, but in the US specifically, it is not it's not a universal ban across the country. It is a state-by-state decision. And the decisions for banning are for minors mostly and only, right, which is great. Great
yeah, of
stuff,
course.
right? Because the minors are usually a population of people who are forced into it early age and have no say, right? And but it's not all states. However, the other piece here, the caveat is that ban is only for licensed professionals. So if you're not a licensed professional, you can still conduct conversion therapy. So there are no laws around that, and no repercussions.
If you're not a licensed professional.
Yeah. So
that's scary.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying, and they do. It's out there. I know it is. So yeah.
Wow.
Based on report from other people that I've treated and people that, just kind of the research that's out there. And it's building. The research is building, which is fantastic, but it's also really sad.
It is. It's terrifying. Like you said. Yeah, it really is. So let's just talk about something in general. So like the political discourse in the world right now, that must be affecting a lot of your patients. And are you seeing a trend of people that are coming in and saying like what's happening in the world and how this is affecting them as a member of our community?
Yeah, so it does come up, and it comes up a lot, a lot more, specific to LGBTQ issues, and I practice right now, and in the U.S. has been, I think, over 400 proposed bills, I think, for anti-gay, anti-trans bills. in large part, our kind of trans community members, trans big family, right, is like they're the ones being targeted. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They're the big bad, if you will. I'm using kind of 90s pop culture reference, like, right? But they're being seen as like this villain in the States, and it's awful. And it reminds me of what was going on in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s with HIV and like gay people. Just right, they're targeting a particular group of people. They're not asking any questions. They're not trying to understand. All they're doing is targeting, and what it's causing is increased, I think, fear, paranoia, and discomfort, which also has, there's some discourse sometimes in the analytic community where it's like, well, we can't think about social issues. We have to think about the individual, but social issues affect the individual, right? And when you hear like you can't use the bathroom of the gender that you identify with, right? Or when you hear that like people of color, queer people of color are getting assaulted, right? And just for simply existing, not doing anything. I hear that. I hear that a lot. I heard it especially worse during the pandemic with my Asian American clients and how they felt during COVID, where they felt targeted, and then my Asian American queer clients feeling the same way, feeling targeted. Right. So you can now not only you can't even walk out your door and feel safe, And I mean, yesterday I got called the F-bomb on the subway platform. I was just standing on the subway platform. I wasn't even like, had my headphones on, I wasn't even paying attention. And like, just like some guy walks over, like looks me dead in the eye and just calls me F word.
You can say it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
Yeah. It's bizarre because that for me probably was a little bit of a trigger from growing up. And then I moved to the UK where that word is used every day because it means cigarette. So someone's always just going to say, do you have a fag? Can I have a fag? I'm going outside for a fag. And when that's just constantly in your ear, I was just like, it just made me so uncomfortable for the longest time. And I think I'm so used to it now, but it will randomly happen when somebody just randomly says it now. And I'm like, oh, you freeze for a second and you're just thinking, okay, what's the situation here? Like, what's happening?
Yes.
And then you realize,
rewire your way of thinking.
Yeah. And then you realize it's simply a cigarette. Like it's nothing.
So, right. It's a non-threat. It's a non-issue. Right?
Exactly.
But where you come from, where you grew up, and all those experiences, it's so deeply embedded in you. And that's kind of exactly what I was talking about earlier with like my own internalized homophobia and what that is and how it affects us. Yeah.
Assess the situation before you react. And that's definitely what I do. And I don't think I would even react unless it was to, again, assess the situation to educate that person. But
yes, it can be, especially if you don't understand the context of that person, right? Sometimes I think if you're in earshot of something and the context can matter, but it's also what are you hearing and how are you interpreting it? But that is more like the trauma responses of it, right? Is that you've learned to see and feel that there's a danger here and I have to either respond to it or withdraw and shut down or dissociate. But these things aren't happening on a conscious level. That takes time. And like you said, like the reassessing, I think I think what people underestimate is how much like mental and emotional energy that takes to do that. Because it's not just a thought, it's a thought that's triggering a series of reactions in your body, both emotional and physiological.
Sure.
Like hearing that yesterday, my whole body tensed up and froze, right? And I felt like I had to go, am I about to like get into a fight, or am I about to get like, hurt? Like, what do I need to run? Like, and so coming from a long history of my own, I've been assaulted multiple times growing up, right? It's not even once, it's like 3 or 4 times, a couple of times with like weapons. So for me, that instinct was like, what do I do? Right.
Yeah.
I have to like think fast. And sometimes the thinking doesn't happen.
No.
Right. It's just responsive.
I think for me, probably my only trigger, something that actually makes me see red and makes me want to say something that I shouldn't, and I don't, but it's probably when I hear a straight woman say to me, "Oh, you're such a waste."
Oh God. Yes. No. Like, what is that?
Yeah. I that's the one thing that makes me see red. And I just feel like this person really needs to be educated.
Absolutely. Well, because I think that comes from a narcissistic place, right? And is that they're thinking like I'm attracted to you for whether it on whatever levels it is, like it's gonna be, external, internal, whatever. And so I can't have you, therefore you are a waste, right? So it's all about them. It's not
Yeah.
about you. It's being directed at you, right? So that they don't have to hold the discomfort, right? And that's just one example of what that is. But I think, and because it could literally be anyone, like saying
Yeah.
the same thing,
Yeah.
saying something similar. But
Yeah. It's
yeah,
crazy
I don't
because there
like
are
it.
things like that where people just don't think about.
Yeah, well, I think it also kind of it dehumanizes you. It's a dehumanizing statement, right?
It
If you're a
is.
waste, then who are you not a waste for, right?
Yeah.
And then it affirms all of that and that negative thinking, negative belief system that you might have developed throughout your life, which most
Exactly. Yeah. Let's talk about body dysmorphia.
okay.
I think that is one of the hot topics in our community because,
Yeah.
especially for people coming out or new to the community, because again, they see a perfect person always
Yes.
as as a public figure for our community. They look
Yeah.
perfect. Everything about them is amazing. In the real world, that's not how it works.
Right.
But
Right.
in your mind, you're like, oh, I need to look like them if I'm going to fit into this community.
Exactly. Yeah, that there is well, I think that there's like a perceived gold standard of what you should look like and how and what you should have. It's not all physical. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
it's like things,
Lifestyle. Yeah.
objects, right? And sometimes people use that as a guiding post to achieve whatever they want to achieve. And then when they can't achieve it, which is, I think I'm just going to tie this into conversion therapy for just a
Sure.
moment,
No, sure.
right? Is that when something like that cannot be achieved, like you cannot change your sexual identity or gender identity. It is however you identified. I mean, that is who you are, right? But when you're told that you can change it and then you can't, you're going to perceive yourself as a consistent failure because you're going to constantly feel like you're failing, right? Which I think is going to put you in this place, constant state of depressive thinking, and then probably moving into like a nihilistic way of thinking. I can't get that. I can't ever have that. I can't ever have that body. I can't ever have that house. I can't ever have that pool, right? And some I think what it ends up doing is that kind of thinking also, the way I see it, deteriorates your like your gift of imagining. Like, and I think that there, I want to separate the two just for a simple second, is that there's a gold standard of how some people think that they should be living, like let's say social media for whatever, and like they're following that and they can't achieve it. We look to social media and we look to just media generally, um, also for inspiration, to escape a little bit, to fantasize what our lives would be like if, right? I think there's a healthy amount of fantasizing that we are allowed to have, but I think when we're also flooded with it and only make that the criteria that we're guided by, it doesn't become a fantasy anymore. It becomes an obsession, right? And I think that the grounding and pulling yourself away from that thinking is a lot harder when you're then now looking in the mirror and you're like, I am completely imperfect. Because at that point, you're only going to be looking for your imperfections. You're not going to be looking for anything of value in yourself, whether it's internal or external. And that's kind of what I mean by like it completely deteriorates your sense of imagination, and self-worth.
100%. 100%. The other subject I'd like to talk about just before we wrap things up
Oh, fast.
is another I know is another great subject within. I think it's probably more discussed by people who don't identify as anybody in our community. It's probably the straight couples who bring this topic up the most on a night out, is monogamy
Hmm.
within the gay community,
Yeah.
or I should say non-monogamous.
No.
And people don't necessarily educate themselves, or
Yeah.
I don't know what the right word is, but they probably don't ask the right questions because they assume a lot.
Yes.
And so, how would you describe that to somebody who comes up to you and says, "Well, it's not really a real relationship because of A, B, C.
Yeah. Well, for one, I think that people who, whether they decide that it is right for their relationship and they choose to move forward with it, the conversations themselves really open up a raw dialogue that I think needs to happen probably for most relationships. That How many people are talking about, you know, intimacy and fantasies and like finances even before they get married, right? And having all open I mean, they may be talking surface level stuff, they're not going deeper, right? Sometimes, I'm not saying everyone, but um, I think the knee-jerk reaction and also the stigma around kind of non-monogamy is that if you need to sleep with other people, right, and or if you need to like date other people, whatever the construct is in your relationship, then do you even have a relationship? And I would argue yes. Right? I would argue yes because they're talking about really sensitive topics. They're learning how to build trust. They're learning how to have to share those experiences, and they're learning how to set boundaries. Right? That all of these things are coming up. That's not the case for every single relationship that's non-monogamous, but it is the case for most. And most people who come my way want to learn how to do that. They want to enhance their ability to communicate more effectively. They want to get more in touch with their emotions. They want to get more in touch with being able to communicate that, but they also want to be able to do that with their partner and take that partner in, not like emotionally and like really connect. And it's such a beautiful thing to see, I think, in that process, right? Because it's not all about lust and like debauchery, right? And like, or your relationship is on the decline. That's it. They're going to be broken up in however many months it's not, right? Like that's the assumption. Now, people who are monogamous, they can do the same thing. They don't have to open it up, right? And I think that it comes from this very like old world way of thinking, very kind of like heteronormative like way of thinking, and in part, a lot of times like informed by religion. You meet someone, you marry someone, you're committed to them for the rest of your life, and they have to be every single thing you need them to be, and every single thing you want them to be at all times, right? Which is not going to happen. It's an unrealistic expectation. So how do you communicate that, right? When you have one night of bad sex, you think your whole relationship is doomed.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't love me anymore. Right?
Yeah.
But that's probably not true, right? So what I want to say is that, and which a point you made earlier, which I thought was really important, is that try not to be so quick to judge someone else's relationship. It's not yours, right? Try to stay focused on what yours is and what you want and who you want. Don't stay, if you're dating, don't stay with a person if you know and they've shared with you that they don't want to be monogamous.
Mm-hmm.
You can't force a square peg into a round hole. Right. And some of that, I think it comes from like the sense of attachment. Like I see someone, I want someone, and I'm leaning into it. And all this is happening on an unconscious level, right? It's like I finally connected with someone. They're the only one out there. There's very kind of like one lane thinking. But they're likely not. I would like to just at least kind of shed a little bit of light on living in a bigger city with a lot more queer people, queer identifying people. Not only will you have more options, but it also might be harder too, right? Because you don't know where people are entering into these big cities from and where they are in their lives. And it doesn't matter the age, right? It really, what matters is where they are internally with who they are and what they're trying to figure out for themselves, right? And a lot of that is on an internal basis. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question there because I feel like there's so much to talk about in it, and I feel like I'm on a tangent, but like,
there's a whole podcast about that one.
Yeah, I think there could be. There really can.
There definitely could be.
But yeah, I don't think one or the other is right or wrong, right? But if you're casting moral judgments on someone else's relationship, then are you really focused on what's going on for yourself then, and what you want, and how do you want to get that? How do you want to achieve that kind of relationship? Because those people are out there. Right? There are people out there who do want to have monogamous relationships. You got to put yourself out there.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to Kevjet's quick fire questions to end this podcast. So I was a bit deep, so I just thought we could move on to something a little bit fun, and let's see what happens. I know it's quick fire. It doesn't always end up being quick fire because the answers tend to sometimes go on, but with a little bit of editing, it always is quick fire.
The magic of editing.
Exactly. What does pride mean to you?
Mm, advocacy. Yeah. I think it means, yeah. For me, it feels it's advocacy.
What's your favorite word?
Oh, I don't know. I used the word moist yesterday to describe how I felt on the subway because it was so humid and hot. So let's go with moist for right now.
I love using that word. It makes everybody uncomfortable. Who is your hero?
Hmm. I'll say my mom. She's overcome a lot, I feel like.
What is your favorite body part?
I don't know what direction to take this.
You can go wherever you like.
Legs. Legs? There's two. I don't know. I would say head too because but mostly because I really engage in like the interpersonal piece, I guess, and
Very good.
the stimulation.
What are you most looking forward to?
That's so I don't know. Oh my gosh, that's a good question. You know what? So I just got married earlier this year, and it would have been that. And now I think what I'll say is because I think it does align is that just kind of seeing where our lives go because we get to kind of live our lives now and in post-wedding world, if you will. Yeah.
Beautiful. Do you believe in ghosts?
No.
What is your guilty pleasure?
Caramel cone Haagen-Dazs ice cream.
Which celebrity annoys you the most?
Oh gosh. I was gonna say all of Kardashians was first thing that came to my mind, but I was like, I don't know. I don't really pay attention then to them
Yeah,
enough
neither do
to be
I.
like,
But yeah, when I see them on TV or whenever, I'm just like, oh,
yeah, I just keep
exactly. If your pet could talk, what would they say about you?
about me. I give them too many kisses.
What do you think the key to living a good life is?
Quality relationships.
What is your deepest fear?
I'll make it light. I don't like sharks, and they terrify me. I don't like going in the ocean. Like,
What makes you hopeful?
honestly, Gen Z. I mean, just kind of seeing their advocacy and like even just the generations before me, just kind of seeing how vocal they are and how much change that they're trying to enact. I think it's amazing.
What song would you choose to play every time you enter a room?
Oh my gosh, I was just thinking about this when I was walking my dog the other day. I think it would depend on my mood. I I am an unironic, I guess, like Britney fan, so it'll probably end up being like a Britney song, probably. Let's just say Circus. I'll just do that one.
Amazing. What is the least important thing that is very important to you right now? I love this
Decorating.
question.
I don't know. I just moved into my new office about a month ago, and so it's not fully decorated yet. So maybe that it's not that important, but it is on my list somewhere to get done.
Sure. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Playful, anxious at times, like right now, and curious.
What does love mean to you?
Love means trust and is having trust, honesty, and security in a relationship, knowing that and reliability, uh, even if they can't be there for you 100% of the time.
Last question. What does the future look like for Nick?
Well, career or personal or both, it doesn't matter. I keep asking you these questions and I already know the answer, I think, at this point. Whatever you want. Let's see. The future for me. I like to write a book on healing from conversion therapy. I mean that is my goal. I have an outline. It's on my mind. And I want to do that. So that's long term, I think.
Do it and come back to
Yes.
kevjet.com. I was going to say Kevjet the podcast.
If you'll have me, I will be happy to come back.
I would
This
love
is
that.
pleasant.
I would love that. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's very important for people to hear, and it's a very important question for a very important episode for people to listen to and start conversations with each other.
Absolutely. I think we need to be doing that more. So yeah, happy Pride.
Happy Pride.